So I'm really thrilled to be here and share this research with you. It's stuff I've been doing in my lab and since I was actually a graduate student about 10 years ago. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is the psychological neural basis of collective cognition. In short, it's about how we think as groups and as part of groups. So with that, I want to start with what is arguably the most famous college football game in the history of psychology. The game took place in 1951 between Dartmouth and Princeton, and it was a particularly aggressive game, and Princeton's All-American quarterback was ultimately injured in the game and had to leave the game. And afterwards, in the Princeton student newspaper, the people who were writing in the paper talked about how aggressive Dartmouth was and how they instigated most of the conflict in the game. And in the Dartmouth student paper, they had a very different impression. They thought that Princeton instigated as much or if not most of the fouls and led to the conflict during the game. And so it seemed to two professors who were at Princeton and Dartmouth that people were having very different interpretations of the exact same event. And so they ran a study and they asked people who were at both games what their memory of the events were in the game, and people had very different impressions. Again, Dartmouth students thought that Princeton was the aggressor and committed more fouls, and our Princeton students thought that Dartmouth team committed more fouls. And then they thought, well, maybe this is because all these people who had watched the game have talked about it after and maybe heard things in the newspaper, it changed their impression. So they actually had them watch a video of the game and immediately after asked them the same sets of questions. And then they found the same pattern all over again, that Dartmouth and Princeton students, immediately after watching the exact same event in front of them, had radically different interpretations of the facts of the game, of what happened. And it got so bad, in fact, that this Dartmouth alumnus who was living halfway across the country got his hands on a video and watched it and found that his friends who were Princeton alumni, they told him that Dartmouth was the more aggressive team, but when he watched the video himself, he didn't see it in the game, and so he actually sent a telegram to Dartmouth University asking them to send him a full video of the game because he thought that the video he was watching must have had information spliced from it. So basically, this is how starkly different people's perceptions of reality were. And the authors of this study concluded that the same sensory impingements emanating from the football field transmitted through the visual mechanisms to the brain also obviously gave rise to different experiences in different people. And so this is basically the thrust of what we're going to talk about today, how what might be doing this, what might be changing how people are interpreting the perceptual input that they're receiving from the world. And so there's the notion that our groups and identities might have some role in this. Actually goes back a long time. Sociologists have long thought that groups have different perceptions and different mental states from individuals. And this was represented by this book published in, I think it was 1917 or so, it was early 20th century, calling this the group mind. Basically that there's some kind of collective psychology, that people might think along the same lines because they're part of some collective or group. And this goes all the way to modern day. People like John Turner have argued that all cognition is social cognition, which is to say that since how we think of ourselves as parts of groups is fluid and changes, that this changes how we're seeing things from moment to moment, depending on what group we belong to. And there's good evolutionary reasons for this. So David Sloan Wilson and E.O. Wilson wrote this paper arguing that there are selection pressures at the group level, and by this they mean that group behavior could be selected for, could be beneficial to groups if you're willing to make some sacrifices for the group and work together as a coherent team. That could give you evolutionary advantages over sets of individuals who didn't cooperate and sacrifice and work together as a team. And so there's going to be pressure over multiple generations to select for people who work better and think better as parts of groups. And psychologists have picked this up and run with it and argued that this is really kind of what's fundamental to social cognition. How we see the world, how we think about the world is fundamentally changed by the groups that we belong to. And one of my heroes, Marilyn Brewer, argues that for this reason, thinking about social psychology of groups can provide us with a number of insights into all aspects of human psychology and cognition. If this is true, if most of human cognition was partially selected for because of how it allowed us to succeed as groups, then knowing something about groups might be fundamental to understanding almost every aspect of cognition or emotion or motivation. And so let me just show you one way that I approach this and think about it. This is a figure from an anthropological study looking at prosociality, so cooperation and working together positively with other people. What you'll see here is a bunch of graphs for humans, which are Homo sapiens, so they're basically the top line, and then these are other non-human primates. And what you see is that humans are prosocial towards closely bonded kin, and they share this with other primates. Closely bonded non-kin, so these are people who aren't necessarily kin, but people that they're tightly connected to. Fellow group members, they're also prosocial too. And one thing that's different from humans relative to any other primate is that humans are also prosocial to anonymous group members. So you can see in that kind of the fourth thing there from the left, that humans will actually be prosocial to group members that they don't even know who they are. All they know is that they're a group member. But this collapses with true strangers. So none of these species are prosocial towards true strangers. And so what really distinguishes humans from all of the primates, it seems, is that humans have this sense of groupiness that extends beyond people they even know, that they're going to help out and cooperate with other group members, even if they don't know who they're cooperating with. All they need to know is that it's a group member. And so let me extend this now and talk about something that maybe you might have heard of in the media, or maybe you're familiar with it. If you've gone to this website called Project Implicit, you'll have the opportunity to take one of these exams at the website, and this is commonly used in all kinds of psychology classes now. And many millions of people have gone online and taken these tests. And what it's called is the Implicit Association Test. And people who take these tests are presented, for example, with African American or European American faces. And they simply have to hit a button if they see an African American face or a European American face. And then part of this is that makes it difficult is that these are paired with good words and bad words. So you'll be presented with a face or a word on the middle of the computer screen, and for some of the trials you have to hit the same button if it's African American or a good word, or if it's a European American or a bad word, you hit a different button. And then these pairings are switched. And what they find, and immediately after you take this, just so you know, you get feedback that looks like this. And it will tell you to what extent you have this automatic implicit association with African American and good, or European American and bad, or the vice versa. And what they find is that the vast majority of people who take this test, certainly most of the participants are from North America, and what they find is that they have a strong automatic preference for white people compared to black people. And there's even some evidence suggesting that this preference might hold even for African American participants. And so what you can see here is that the vast majority of people have some preference for white people compared to black people. And so this has inspired a new way of thinking about prejudice and discrimination. And what the researchers have argued is that even good people, people who want to be egalitarian, often have some hidden bias that can be measured with these implicit measures. So they might show some automatic preference for white people compared to black people, even though if you were to ask them, they would say, no, I would never discriminate and I don't hold such attitudes. And so that's why the subtitle of their book is called The Hidden Biases of Good People. Because people, even with the best of intentions, might have these negative implicit associations towards certain groups. And a lot of this work has been understood through some work in neuroscience inspired by a colleague of mine here at New York University, Joe Ledoux. And he looks at the neural roots of fear. And so here's a common analogy he uses to describe this process. So imagine that you're taking a walk in the woods. It's pleasant, invigorating. The sun is shining through the leaves. Suddenly a rattlesnake appears at your feet. You experience something at that moment. You freeze. Your heart rate shoots up, and you begin to sweat. A quick automatic sequence of physical reactions. And that reaction is fear. And so in essence, what he's arguing is that there's some kind of instinct, automatic reaction that prepares you to deal with things that might be threatening to you, that might harm you. And so this is basically a cartoon of what that model looks like of the neural systems that are involved in threat responses. And so basically imagine that you're seeing something that looks like it might be a snake. You see that obviously by opening your eyes. That information is immediately sent to the thalamus, and then it's sent to the back of the brain, to the visual cortex. And then you can slowly, over a few hundred milliseconds, process the information and make out that it's a snake. And if it's a snake, then that information is sent to the amygdala so you can engage in a fight or flight response. Now, what Joe Ledoux found that was really revolutionary in neuroscience was that there might actually be a shortcut to that process to help save you. And so what he argued is that there's this, in red, what's called the fast track response, or some people call it the low road, where the information is sent from the eye to the thalamus. And before you even know what you see, kind of a fuzzy outline of it is sent to the amygdala to prepare a response. And then, in the meanwhile, the back of the brain is doing the work of figuring out what it is you're exactly seeing. And what he argued is it's better for the brain to have a system that allows you to jump out of the way the moment that you see a twig when you're hiking along. Even if there's a low chance that it's going to be a snake, it's a smart move from an evolutionary perspective to just jump out of the way in case it might be a snake. And so that uses a couple calories, but on the whole, that type of response is going to help you survive and pass along your genetic material, and it's going to feed into future generations who have that preparedness to automatically react to things that might be threatening, even if they don't yet know quite what it is. And so maybe you might have had this response. I've been walking through the woods with my wife, has this fear of snakes, and she sees a twig and she jumps out of the way very quickly before she realizes it's a twig. And so I've seen this in practice, certainly. And this work has helped understand the mechanisms behind this implicit racial bias that I've been telling you about. So first I'm going to show you a figure of bold signal in the amygdala in a study by Paul Whalen's group. And what they did was they brought in black and white participants and had them see black and white faces while they were in an MRI machine. And what they found is that black-white participants had greater amygdala response to racial outgroup members, at least during the second scan that they gave them. Other work has found that amygdala responses to racial outgroup members are also correlated with individual differences in their implicit racial bias. So they had these participants in this study by Liz Phelps, Mahzreen Banaji, Will Cunningham, and others. They found that when they were looking at black versus white faces, participants who had the greatest amygdala response to black faces also had the greatest implicit racial bias. In other words, these negative associations to blacks relative to whites that I showed you about on a couple of slides ago. And they found this with multiple implicit measures correlated with amygdala activity. And so these studies seem to suggest that maybe this is activating this evolutionarily old threat response system, that when you learn negative stereotypes or have negative associations towards a certain outgroup, that you have this automatic, inflexible, implicit reaction that is equivalent to this threat response that you're seeing in the amygdala to snakes. And now, stepping back from this, what I want to suggest to you today is that it might be a little bit more complex than that. So when you're seeing somebody on the street, what I'm going to try to argue is that it's something like a perceptual illusion. When you encounter anybody on the street, you can see them in multiple ways. So look at this visual illusion on the left. And if you look at it one way, you can see there's an old woman there with kind of her mouth and eye looking to the left. But if you tilt your head about 30 degrees, you might also see a young woman kind of looking off into the distance with a kind of a small nose, and her chin is where the old woman's nose was. And what you can take from this is that looking one way or the other, you can really only tend to see one of these images at the time. Either you see the old woman and you're thinking maybe about stereotypes associated with old women. If you look another way and tilt your head slightly, you see a young woman, and that might activate different thoughts and associations you have towards younger women. And these types of things can have potentially important implications for how we treat people in the world. And what I'm going to suggest is that when you're walking down the street and you see somebody, you can perceive them in multiple different ways. And what I want to further suggest is that instead of thinking of the brain on its own as reacting reflexively to certain things in our environment, it helps to think about how our brain is also interpreting social information. So instead of being alone most of the time, we're embedded in social context. And we're constantly trying to interpret what the goals and expectations are of the people around us so that we can fit in and succeed in those social environments. And many times these are parts of groups. So this might be a team at work. This might be a group of fans at a soccer game or a hockey game. These can be any types of informal groups, that you can imagine. And turns out we belong to many, many groups, not only in terms of our race and gender and age, but our professional affiliations, our sports teams, our religious associations. These all provide us with different groups that we belong to. And so not only are we trying to interpret what people are doing, but that information is then changing how we think about ourselves and how we behave in a social context. And so let me show you the most classic example of this in my mind. So in 1971, a social psychologist, Henri Tajfel, found, and I think was somewhat shocked to discover, that merely flipping a coin and putting somebody as part of a group, even with people that they don't interact with, they suddenly start to show a preference for members of their own group. And he called this the in-group, and the other group would be called the out-group. And people who are just merely assigned to a group for the most arbitrary of reasons, even if they never interact with members of the group or never see them, they don't know any of their names or who they are, just knowing that they're part of a group is enough to activate this group psychology and get us to make preferences and judgments that favor members of our own group over the other group. And there doesn't need to be any stereotypes or history of conflict or animosity between the groups for us to immediately start doing this type of behavior. And so what he argued is that maybe we have expectations for how we should behave in groups, and it's just the most simple, trivial thing that activates these expectations. And so what we did in our studies is, going back to that work I showed you on implicit racial bias, we wanted to see if these group biases that you can activate on a moment's notice might actually override these seemingly automatic, inflexible reactions that people have to race. And so what we did in our series of studies I'm going to show you today is that we brought participants into our lab and we assigned them to one of two teams. We flipped a coin and they were assigned to teams like the Lions or the Tigers. And as you can see here, race is perfectly independent of group membership. And what I mean by that is that half of each team is black and half of each team is white. And so this allowed us to see what's going to happen when you give people different measures, when you look at their amygdala responses and their implicit bias. Are you going to see that these racial effects emerge rapidly and inflexibly? And if so, then they should emerge presumably for both teams. But if group membership is really powerful and this group psychology and collective identity is so strong, maybe it can override even our most initial reactions to people and orient our attention and preferences towards members of our own group, even if they happen to be of a different race than us. And so first I'm going to show you our participants in these studies would rate how much they liked these individuals after the study. So they saw these faces and learned them for 5 to 15 minutes. Afterwards, we said, how much do you think you'd like interacting with this person? And what we found is, on average, people reported that they thought that they liked members of their in-group more than the out-group. And let me see, yes. And so relative to the midpoint of the scale, they seem to like black and white in-group members. But what you'll notice here is that they were pretty agnostic or indifferent towards the out-group. And so since there was no real competition or stereotypes towards the out-group, people were fairly indifferent to them. They had no real preference or feeling either way about the out-group. But clearly the in-group had some kind of emotion attached to it that they valued them. And then we put participants in the scanner and measured brain activity. Specifically, we were looking at activity in the amygdala, since it was involved in earlier studies on race. And we wanted to see if there's this evidence for this kind of implicit racial reaction, that people kind of had this fear response to African Americans who they were seeing in the study, just like as in earlier work, or if maybe the people that matter to you more in this context, who in this case were the in-group, they're the only ones that really had any emotion attached to them, as I showed you, if that might drive activation in the amygdala. If it's really about just tracking stuff that people and information that's important to you, then you should see no effects of race and no interaction with race. And in fact, that's just what we found. So this is the arrows there is pointing to activation in the amygdala in our participant group, and this was to in-group members greater than out-group members. There were no effects of race and no interaction with race. And so it seemed to suggest that this neural system that seems to be linked to implicit racial bias and threat and this low-road threat detection response actually is tracking group membership. People who are important to you, people who you say that you like, are activating the amygdala. And so this is really quite different from this automatic, inflexible threat response that people were perceiving in these earlier studies. And so what it suggests is a few things. First of all, it suggests that the effects of race are somewhat malleable and flexible, and that these components of social perception, like the amygdala, are actually highly sensitive to things like our group identities, which are often termed social identities. And so it does seem like there is this aspect of collective psychology that people identify with a team really quickly, and that changes how they perceive and process individuals. But I wanted to see, my colleagues wanted to see if this was actually really changing people's automatic reactions. One way in which MRI studies are quite limited is that you don't really see a response in the brain until about 5 seconds after people are presented with an image. It takes about at least that long. And that's actually a little bit slow. People can adjust their response and think through things a little bit. But we were arguing that when people see a face, they can, like that perceptual illusion I was showing you earlier, they could see this person as black, and that might activate a negative association. But if they see them as an in-group member, it might automatically activate a positive association. So again, much like this perceptual illusion, we thought that the people that we were being presented in our studies could be perceived in different ways, and this would automatically activate different associations. And so what we did is we had what's called an evaluative priming task, and people would see these faces very quickly for only 150 milliseconds, so just a split second, and then they would see a positive or negative word and simply have to judge if that word was positive or negative. And they had to do that very quickly. We only gave them 450 milliseconds to make that decision. And what's been shown with this type of measure in previous studies is that participants usually, after they see a white face, it activates positivity in their mind, and that makes them more accurate to the positive words, whereas black faces that are presented generally activate negativity, and that makes participants more accurate to negative words. And so that's what previous research has shown over and over again, suggesting that racial biases are automatically activated. And what we wanted to see is when people are part of a mixed race team, can you override these racial biases? So again, participants came into the study, and some of them were assigned to a mixed race team, and some of them were not. Some of them were simply put in front of these two mixed race teams, but they were not a part of either team. And so this allowed us to see just seeing people in a mixed race environment override your racial biases. And our people in our control condition seem to suggest no, it doesn't. As you can see here, participants were more accurate to positive words than negative words for white faces, and that's really consistent with earlier work. It suggests that people had some kind of automatic racial preference for whites. And so there's really no difference for black faces, but you do see this preference for white faces. People have this automatic preferences for white faces. Even when it was a mixed race environment, these implicit racial biases were still coming online very early and shaping people's judgments. Now, looking at people who were actually assigned to one of these teams, who were told that they're a part of the team, we found something quite different. So first of all, when you look at people's attitudes towards or associations towards outgroup members, what you can see is something similar to the control condition. When people were presented with outgroup faces, they seem to have, if anything, a slightly negative association towards black outgroup members and a positive association towards white outgroup members. And so overall, this pattern, and it was statistically significant, suggests that there's, again, racial bias towards outgroup members. Participants preferred whites over blacks. But when you looked at their associations towards in-group members, you found something quite different. People had positive associations to black in-group members and white in-group members. And so what this suggested is that we were able to get rid of racial bias, even on these automatic measures. Participants seem to have a preference to anybody who's part of their in-group, regardless of their race. So taking that seriously, we thought, man, these things are happening very quickly, that there is this kind of collective identity that people are getting into, even this very trivial identity, and it's shaping their very rapid reactions and judgments of people within a couple hundred milliseconds. And it's really strong in that it overrides racial biases that people have thought are automatic and fairly inflexible and hard to change. But again, those responses between the time they saw the image to when they made their response took about 600 milliseconds or so. And so it was quite possible that these things were, this was some aspect of self-presentation. Maybe participants were seeing this face and then remembering, oh, it's an in-group member, you should like them, and then that was changing their response. It seemed unlikely, but it was possible. And so our next set of studies that we're writing up for publication right now, so these are, as of yet, unpublished data. We had participants come in, and we put an EEG cap on their head. And for those of you who aren't familiar with EEG, what it does is it doesn't tell you exactly where in the brain something is happening, as well as MRI, but it can tell you how fast it's happening, down to the millisecond. And so this gave us millisecond precision to see how fast are these collective concerns, their group identities, shaping their responses to other people. And is it really changing their rapid initial response to the faces that they're seeing? Are they seeing them in terms of their group membership rather than in terms of their race? And so in this study, we looked at the fastest ERP component that you can measure using EEG, and it happens around 100 milliseconds after you're presented with an image. So this is really too fast for people to engage in reflective processing and try to strategically show something to the participants. And so we measured electrodes in the back of the brain in the occipital lobe. This is the visual system using EEG. And what we found is results that were almost identical to the previous studies that we had run. So if you look at outgroup members here, what you see is that people seem to have some kind of racial bias towards outgroup members, around 100 milliseconds after just seeing the faces. And so again, this is a rapid initial pattern of racial bias. But the moment that people are part of your in-group, this racial bias is reduced significantly. It's not completely eliminated here, but it was reduced, and we've now replicated this in a second study at another university. And so what this seems to suggest is that group memberships are changing how we perceive people as early as 100 milliseconds after we're seeing them. This is 1/10 of a second, very rapid. And what this suggests is just how deeply embedded our group identities are, and even these trivial ones kind of activate a way of thinking about people that's very different maybe from the way that we normally go around the world. And you might be thinking, that's great, but who cares? What does it mean? This next set of studies, I'm going to suggest to you that this actually has important implications for consequential real-world decisions. And so first I want to tell you about this phenomenon called own race bias. And it's often characterized as the perception that people all look alike to me. And we've known about this for 100 years or so, and there's been dozens of studies showing that people from other races all tend to look alike. And they've shown this among whites, Asians, African Americans. Numerous ethnic groups tend to think that people from other ethnic groups all look alike. And so this is really considered important because it has huge implications for things like eyewitness identification. So this is really important in the legal literature because when people are looking at an eyewitness lineup like the one I have presented in front of you, if they think that members of another race all look alike, then they're more likely to accidentally pick out the wrong suspect out of a lineup. And it turns out now that we have DNA and we can go back and look at a number of cases and see were people who were identified in eyewitness lineups actually guilty of the crimes. It turns out that most people who have been exonerated by DNA were innocent and not, sorry, let me restate that. Most people who have been exonerated by DNA and have been shown to be innocent, it turns out in most of those cases, it's because they were sent to prison because of one or two eyewitnesses who misidentified them. And it turns out that in almost all those cases, except for one, it was a white eyewitness misidentifying a black suspect. And so it turns out that African Americans, unfortunately, bear the brunt of this own race bias when it comes to criminal decisions, because if they're misidentified more by white suspects, then they're going to be thrown into prison unnecessarily. And so this has happened over and over and over again. And the way that researchers have thought about this, at least since the 60s, is that it's really about expertise. The thinking was that people have family members who tend to be of their own race. They tend to have friends and members of their immediate neighborhood who tend to share their race. And so they become expert at identifying the physiognomic facial features that differentiate one member of their own race from another race, but they just don't ever develop the expertise to differentiate members of other races. And so this is how people have thought about the drivers between what's causing the own race bias for many years. And just as a way of background, this eyewitness lineup I've shown you here is a case where I think it was suspect number 5 was misidentified and sent to prison for over a decade and was later freed based on DNA evidence. And so research has shown some of the early social neuroscience research, a paper in Nature Neuroscience that I think is quite good, suggested that this is really what's going on, is that people have better expertise at identifying members of their own race. And so they had European American, African American participants, and they viewed participants of their own race and the other race. And what they found is that there was greater activation in the fusiform face area, which is a part of the brain that's involved in processing faces, and presumably because It's involved in expert level processing because we're more expert at processing faces. Turns out that participants who had, in the study, who had greater fusiform face area activity to own race faces also had greater memory advantage for same race faces relative to other race faces. And so this was really compelling evidence that was published suggesting that this expertise hypothesis might help explain why people are engaging this own race bias. But we thought maybe this isn't quite the case. So we ran, based on our other studies, it seemed to us that social identity might play as much of a role here as race. And so maybe people identify as being white or black in those situations, and that might be driving a lot of the own race memory bias, rather than just expertise. And so we ran an MRI study where we identified the fusiform face area in each participant. And it turns out it tends to move around a little bit from one participant to the next, so you have to have a special scanning sequence to identify it in each individual. And then we're able to look within the fusiform face area to see was it responding more to in-group versus out-group members, as we had predicted, or is it responding to race? And what we found, again, after we assigned people to these mixed race teams, we found evidence consistent with our hypothesis. There was greater activation in the fusiform face area to in-group relative to out-group faces. And again, these groups are groups that they just learned a couple minutes before. It's important to also note here that we put unaffiliated faces. So these were faces they were seeing for the first time in the scanner, and they were not part of the in-group or the out-group. Oops. Sorry. So that's the set of bars to the right. And what we found, and we did this to see, is it because people are having enhanced processing of in-group members, or are they basically not identifying out-group members as well? And what we found is it really seems to be about enhancement for the in-group. So it really seems to be the moment you're part of a group, people try to figure out who you are. They look at your facial configuration and identify you as an individual within that group. And that's not happening for out-group. But we also found, just like as in the earlier work on race, that participants who had the greater activation pattern in the fusiform face area to in-group members were also people who had better memory for in-group members over out-group members. And so it really did suggest, and in this study there were no effects of race, no interaction with race in group membership. And what it suggested to us is that even this thing that people seem to think that is built into you over 10 or 20 or 30 years of interacting with people in your own race is really about group membership. All it takes is about 5 minutes of being told that you're in another group and looking at those faces to shift how you're perceiving people. And it seems like you attend more and pay more attention to in-group members in those situations. It's almost like it bolsters attention and encoding of in-group members. And as I said, there's really no decrement for out-group members relative to unaffiliated faces, which really shows it's this in-group enhancement. And we looked at models of face processing, and basically it turns out that they seem to have it wrong. They seem to think that the default way that we process faces is by thinking about them as an in-group member. And if you see them as an out-group member, you tend to ignore them. But what our data suggests is that, and having these unaffiliated faces was very helpful, by seeing that this is really not about ignoring out-group members, it's really about enhancing in-group members. And so it seems like, using our unaffiliated faces as a baseline, it seems like the default is the bottom route, where if you don't know somebody or they're an out-group member, you kind of ignore them. But the moment that they're an in-group member, you enhance processing and encoding and recognition. And so it suggests that maybe the ways that we've been thinking about face processing are wrong, that they've been misunderstanding how group membership changes how we perceive people. And so I just want to tell you briefly about some follow-up studies we did. It turns out that what group membership is really doing is enhancing attention towards in-group members, and that's what's increasing memory towards in-group members. And so during the learning phase, we found that people are actually, when you tell them they're part of a group, they're looking more at in-group members than out-group members. And that's what is giving them this enhanced memory, which is not surprising. We've also done manipulations where we thought, you know, if that's the case, then maybe we can get them to attend to out-group members and get rid of this preference for in-group members. And that's exactly what happens. If you put them in these minimal groups, but you tell them that they're a spy, you can see that suddenly they go from, in another condition where we just told them they're a soldier, they have more memory for in-group over out-group faces. But the moment you tell them they're a spy, suddenly they're attending to out-group members just as much. And so this process by which we perceive people around us and try to figure out who they are is really flexible. And it turns out that any number of motivations can change it, including just telling people they're a spy, because when you're a spy, being a good group member means paying attention to what the outgroup member is doing. And participants are readily willing to do that. It doesn't take much instruction, and naturally they'll suddenly start paying more attention to the outgroup members and figuring out who they are. We've also found that this is really about social connection. So participants in a series of studies we run, we activated their need for social connection by making them kind of socially rejecting them, or just simply just telling them a computer assigned them to work alone. And if you socially reject them, presumably what it's doing is activating their need to connect to other people. And what you see is that when people are socially connected and they have this need to belong that's activated, that's really when you see the strongest pattern of memory advantage for in-group relative to out-group faces. And so those are the bars on the left here in the social rejection condition. And so it really seems that when people have this motivation to connect to others, then they privilege their memory and attention towards in-group members. And so you might imagine walking into a cocktail party and you don't know anybody. Walking into a party like that tends to activate this need to connect to others. And what you're probably most likely to do is not look and interact with a stranger. What you're probably most likely to do in that situation, and our data suggests this, is that you're going to look for somebody from your own university or hometown or country to connect to and start a conversation with. And so we really think that's what's going on here, is that same process. When this need to connect is heightened, then you look for somebody who's part of your group. And partly because that's what groups do. Our groups are how we get social connection needs fulfilled. And so that's where you really see the pattern of in-group bias. And when people are just told to work alone, so again, they're alone in both situations, but in this case, it was just the computer had them work alone. They don't have the same preference for in-group members, presumably because this need for social connection is not active. And so the main take-home point from the first half of the talk is that when we're thinking about social perception, like seeing other people, sure, things like race and Afrocentric features and stereotypes, those things matter in terms of shaping perception and brain activity. But it's also important to take into consideration top-down motives. And in this case, what we think is really important is group membership. Our group membership seem to motivate us to perceive the world differently. And then this is in turn, amplified by, the need to belong and social connection needs. They make these effects much stronger. And so basically the take-home points from the first part are that social perception and evaluation seem to be really sensitive to social identity, and that these exert a top-down influence on what we often think of as automatic, implicit, rapid, bottom-up reactions. So even as early as 100 milliseconds, it seems like our social identities are changing how we're perceiving other people. Okay, one thing I often get asked when I present this data, especially because we really show that you can get rid of a lot of effects of race, people often ask me, well, our participants, this is happening so quickly, are participants literally becoming colorblind? And that's a legitimate question and a provocative one, because certainly in the United States there's big debates about whether you can make people colorblind and whether that's the best way to get people to overcome bias and discrimination. And it's hotly debated. So we actually looked at our neuroimaging data to see, using the brain data, could you actually, so certainly there's no patterns of preference for in-group over out-group, but when you actually looked within these regions, could you find patterns of activation that allowed you to predict whether people are seeing a black or white face? So this is often called multivoxel pattern classification or multivoxel pattern analysis. And I won't go into too much detail, except to say that in the early visual system, so the VC there is the visual cortex, that's the very earliest part of the visual processing stream, V1 it's often referred to, and fusiform gyrus, which is involved in, as I've shown you, face processing. It turns out that in both these regions, that you can actually use the patterns of activation within them to detect race above chance, above 50%. And so what this suggests is that even though there's no preference for black over white, it's basically what this is suggesting is that people aren't colorblind. The visual system is still picking up on color. It just seems that it's not using it to make preference judgments. And so I don't know if you can see this on your computer screens at home, but this says no. This is actually a colorblind test. But no, people are not colorblind in our studies, at least our MRI studies. And so what it suggests is that group membership is changing your preferences for people and how you process them, but it's not literally making you colorblind. So that's an important qualification to this research. So next I'm going to shift to the second half of my talk. I have about 25 minutes left. And what I'm going to show you is some research that the effects of identity go well beyond perceiving things and judging people on the basis of race and social memory. So a recent series of studies have used stimuli like this face here. They've taken faces that looked human versus faces that look non-human, like mannequins or dolls, and they morph them to see how people perceive them. So here's an example of a face that goes from 100% human and 0% doll-like on the left, all the way to 100% doll-like and 0% human on the right. And so you can use video morphing software to create a continuum by which a face is human to non-human. And this research that had initially pioneered this technique found out that when participants were asked to make this judgment when they were seeing these faces, whether they're, they have a mind and they can feel pain, they can plan things, what they found is that it seems to be some tipping point. So up until a certain point, you say this person does not have a mind. And then once there's about 63 to 64% humanness in the face, then it seems to be a tipping point where you suddenly start to see these faces as having a mind. So it takes a lot of humanness, basically. And then you suddenly shift from saying this person does not have a mind to this person has a mind. And so what we've done, and this project was led by a PhD student in my lab, have used these faces, and we've looked to see, is this just the bottom-up visual input to the faces that's driving these perceptions of having a mind, or are these judgments influenced by group membership? And so what we did is in our first study, we did a minimal group study like the ones I've shown you before, but in this case, we had people estimate dots, and we give them feedback saying that you're an overestimator or an underestimator, and again, the feedback was random, and it was determined by basically a flip of a coin. And we wanted to see, does that change whether or not they see people as having a mind? So we compared their responses to in-group members and out-group members. And what we found is that, again, as in the previous research, there seems to be some tipping point after which they see faces as having a mind, taking between about 60 and 67% humanness. But what's really interesting from our perspective is that this seems to be shaped by these group memberships. So again, being part of a minimal group seems to drop the threshold of humanness required to actually see a mind. And so basically, it only takes about 61% humanness to see a mind behind an in-group face, but it takes about 66 or 67% humanness to see a mind behind an out-group face. And so basically, what you're looking at here is kind of the tipping point where they start to see the faces having a mind. It drops for in-group members. And so basically, you're privileging in-group members. You're more likely and more ready to see a mind behind an in-group member face. And here's just a kind of zooming in and looking at the point of subjective equality at which they saw faces having a mind more than half of the time. Again, you can see that in-group members, it requires less humanness to see a mind behind those faces. We ran other studies with real groups like New York University, where we belong, and versus Boston University, an out-group that is very similar in size to NYU and status, but not really a threatening out-group. And we also measured the extent to which they actually care about being a part of the university. So some participants care about being part of the university. They have New York University sweatshirts and mugs. Those participants, it turns out, are driving our effect almost entirely. So participants who don't care about NYU, over here, these have low identification with New York University. They don't really have any difference in to what extent they see a mind behind an in-group or out-group member face. But people who highly identify with the university have a very low threshold for perceiving a mind behind an in-group member face and a very high threshold for perceiving a mind behind an out-group member face. We've now done MRI studies with this, and so you can actually look across the whole spectrum from non-human to human, what parts of the brain are being affected by group membership when people are seeing these faces. And it turns out that what's driving our effect is this activation in this part of the posterior superior temporal sulcus. And so this part of the brain is involved in very low-level social cognition. It's involved in things like detecting animacy among moving objects, seeing them as having some animacy behind them, moving in a consistent pattern, and biological motion. And so these are kind of the rudiments of social cognition, the most basic elements. And what we're finding is that this is where group membership is shaping perception. It's literally changing the lowest level of mental state attribution, the extent to which people see somebody as having a mind or not. But I've shown you that this is really all in-group bias. It turns out that there might be some reasons where it's in some cases where it's important to see a mind behind an out-group face. And so we thought that might be particularly true when there's a high degree of threat and conflict between the groups. And so what we did is we looked at Republican and Democrats' perceptions of mind for Republican and Democrat faces. And we did this right before the 2012 presidential election in the United States. And the reasoning being that when you're in a close, tight battle with another group and they're potentially threatening to win the election, then it's really important to know what they might plan next, to know what they're up to, and to get inside their mind and to take their mental thoughts seriously because they're a threat to you. And so we measured to what extent Democrats and Republicans thought the other party was threatening to them. And what we found, we thought that this would actually give us a leverage on this issue is, are we just seeing dehumanization in these studies? That they're not seeing members of outgroups as having a mind or any mental states. They're not seeing them as human. Or is it a little bit more complex than these models of dehumanization might suggest? And it turns out it is. It turns out that when people are perceiving a low degree of threat, on the left, we show the pattern that we've shown you several times. People have a lower threshold for perceiving a mind behind an in-group face than an out-group face. That's the two bars you see on the left. But if you look on the right, when people, Democrats and Republicans, were perceiving a high degree of threat from the other party, the pattern of results fully reversed. In this condition, participants were having a much more lower threshold for perceiving a mind behind an out-group face. And what we think is going on here is that when you're threatened, it's important to keep in mind what the out-group might do next, because that way you can plan your next steps. And this is exactly the type of data that we're finding. And so we're now following this up, but we already have some evidence that it's not a simple dehumanization story here. It seems to be about motivation, that you might be more motivated to see in-group members as having a mind most of the time, but there are certain circumstances where it might be more important to get inside the minds of the out-group. And so what this suggests, again, is something similar to the first part of the talk I gave, is that bottom-up visual cues, like the humanness in a face and the vividness of the eyes and nose and mouth, only get you so far. They can help, the brain can use them to try to figure out if there's an agent in front of you that you can interact with. But again, groups in the social context and things like threat are also playing a role. And so we can't have a full understanding of even things like basic mind perception and animacy detection unless we take into consideration the social context and group identities. As I said from the outset of the talk, I'm just going to show you a couple more studies. The outset of the talk I argued that, some people have argued that all cognition is social cognition. And so in other words, not just these social perception, perceiving people and judging them, but maybe more basic aspects of cognition are sensitive to our group identities. And so let me show you some hints of that from other labs and our labs. And so here's a nice paper showing that identities potentially can shape how far away we see physical distances. So in this study, they had people just estimate how far 2 points were on a map. And so they showed them a map of the United States and a map of Canada. And so Americans who were looking to estimate the distance between a point in the United States and Canada thought that it was much further away than the exact same distance between 2 points in the United States. And what they thought was that this is just categorical perception, that when something's part of another category, like another country, it's just seen as more different. It's seen as further away. Other work has shown that fondness makes distance grow shorter. And so they have shown, for example, that a bottle of water might seem closer when you're more thirsty because you want to drink it. And so this led to this hypothesis that things we like seem closer to us. But there's also evidence to the contrary. So in this study, they had spider phobics estimate the distance to spiders. And what they found, like these tarantula that you're seeing here, and what they found is that spider phobics are much more likely than normal people who are not phobics to see these spiders as closer than they actually were. And so this is really, the opposite of what you predict from those other studies. Fondness makes things seem closer. This suggests that, dangerous things or negative things, threatening things might actually make them seem closer under some circumstances. And so we designed a study to look at how identities play a role in this, to see whether fondness might make another group seem closer, physically closer, to distort your estimations of physical distance or not. And so my PhD student Jenny Shao and I did a study where we went up to Yankee Stadium and had them estimate how far away it was to Fenway Park, who were their arch rivals. And at the time, these are the American League standings when we ran the study. And what you can see is that at the time they were first and second place. They were the two of the best teams in baseball. And so for Yankees fans, the Boston Red Sox were very threatening at that moment. And then we also had them estimate how far away the Baltimore Orioles were. And at the time, the Baltimore Orioles were a perennial bottom dweller. They were consistently the worst team in the division for many, many years, and certainly that season. And so we had the participants estimate the distance to Fenway Park and Camden Yards on a map, as you can see there on the left. So I draw points on a map where you thought these two stadiums were relative to a Yankee Stadium, where participants were at the time when they were doing the study. And then we also had them estimate in a straight line to Fenway Park and Camden Yards, to this threatening outgroup and to this non-threatening outgroup. And just to show you on a map where these actually were, you can see Yankee Stadium's in the middle, and Fenway Park is in the north, and the Baltimore Orioles, Camden Yards is in the south. And it's important to note here, just as a matter of fact, that these weren't perfectly controlled, that it turns out Fenway Park was actually a little bit further away. And please keep that in mind, because this is one of those pseudo experiments. So that's an important fact. And this allowed us to look at whether this categorization hypothesis was true, just that part of a team from another group that's more distant than you might seem further away because they're part of another category. Or this positivity hypothesis, which again, if you don't like the group, they should seem further away. Or the relevance hypothesis, that if you actually care about a team and they're threatening to you, in that case, it might be important to imagine them as a little bit closer so that you can engage in some kind of response to them. And what we found, first I'll show you among non-Yankees fans at the stadium. So these are people who are mainly just tourists. This is what they do in the summer in New York. They go to the Yankee Stadium to watch a game, and they don't care about any of these teams. What we found is that tourists were pretty accurate. Tourists knew that Camden Yards was further away than Fenway Park. They weren't exactly accurate in how many miles away, but they had the relative distances right. They knew that Fenway Park was further away than Camden Yards. And now if you look at these gray bars, you see the exact opposite, that Yankee fans were distorted. They thought that Camden Yards was much further away than Fenway Park. In other words, they thought that this threatening outgroup, this home of the threatening outgroup, was actually seemed to be looming larger or seemed more close or imminent. And that was very similar to the study I showed you with spider phobics, that the thing that you find most threatening might actually seem closest. We ran another study looking at NYU versus Columbia. And when you tell people that Columbia and NYU are two great universities that represent the city of New York very positively, then there's really no effect. They see Columbia about as far away as it is. But if you tell them that Columbia is actually a better university and more an Ivy League school that has more stringent admission criteria, then that threatens staff and students at New York University. And what you see is when they're threatened, then they suddenly see Columbia campus as much closer than it actually is, kind of impinging on their territory in New York. We had another study taking this to kind of a real-world issue that actually had big implications. We had participants in New York estimate how far away Mexico City was, and many Americans are concerned about illegal Mexican immigration. It turns out that participants who were most worried about it, or most threatened by illegal Mexican immigrants coming over into the United States and changing American culture, those are the ones who saw Mexico City as much closer than it actually was. And we think this has big implications because the United States government is spending tens of millions of dollars to build this fence between the United States and Mexico. And we think it might be because people have, when they find a group threatening, they have a distorted perception of reality. They see the threatening group as more imminent than it actually is, and that can lead to major policy decisions. And we think this is important because throughout human history and around the world, there's all kinds of evidence of segregation and putting walls up between groups. And it seems like if you just a cursory look through human history suggests that these are really when there's perceived threat, and that you want to keep another group in their place. And this might serve some kind of psychological benefit for people, but it comes at an enormous cost. So the most classic historical case is the Great Wall of China, which would, in today's dollars, would cost $260 million to build, I believe. And so this was basically because they were worried about a threat to the country, the Mongolians. So it turns out you can change how people perceive the threat. And so if you tell them that In other studies, we found that if you tell them that the wall between the United States and Mexico is secure versus that it's insecure, it turns out if you do that, then you get rid of this threat effect. And so again, people who think that there's a weak border and they're threatened by Mexicans see Mexico City as much closer than it actually is. But if you tell them there's a strong border, then they actually see Mexico City as further away. Basically, once you put up the border, you're alleviating that threat from their mind, that psychological threat. It turns out you can manipulate how close people see another group. And so in one study, we went up to Yankee Stadium again and had them see the logos as very close on a grid paper or very far away. And we found some evidence that when the other group seemed too close for comfort, that highly identified members of the group, so these are people who are strong Yankees fans, wanted to, if they saw the Red Sox as too close to them, they wanted to support discriminatory policies. They didn't want Red Sox fans being able to come to Yankee Stadium. They wanted to keep them out of the stadium. And so it seems that these aspects of group conflict and threat might make a group seem closer, and they might literally shape distance perception. But thankfully, we have some evidence here that you can get rid of these biases by leaving them to believe that the fences are strong between them, and then this gets rid of the threat in their mind. You can also do this for more pro-social and certainly much less expensive means. So we have other studies showing that if you promote forgiveness between groups, then they don't see them as too close. The threatening group is no longer seen as too close. And so there are some more pro-social positive ways to deal with this bias other than just building walls. And so again, we think this has important implications because if you see a group as too close or threatening, and then you can see them as too close, it can lead to things like discrimination, as we found at Yankee Stadium, in terms of raising the ticket prices and demanding that the other fans of their team aren't even allowed in the stadium. And so with that, I'm just going to skip through the last study and just conclude really quickly. The basic point of this talk today is that there might be something important rather than just thinking about brains as individuals, and certainly that's where much of social neuroscience has gone. It's really about putting people in a scanner or an EEG machine and looking at brain activity as they're seeing things, and they're really on their own. It's important to take in mind that humans really are social animals in many ways, and there's good evolutionary reasons and psychological reasons to think that we'd be concerned about our groups, and that our groups are going to shape not only structure and function, but how we interact on a moment-to-moment basis in terms of the groups that we see around us and how we identify with them. And so it's not just that we're interpreting them, but they're changing how we see ourselves and maybe even basic aspects of perception and how we see the world. And so what I want to suggest here is, and certainly we're not the first people to suggest this, but that our group identities play an important role in shaping our cognition. And our lab is finding out now it's not just how we perceive other people, but it might even change things like perceiving physical distances. Or other data I didn't have time to show you today is about smell. Our identities, for example, Swiss participants who are primed with their Swiss identity smell chocolate as stronger because it's an important part of the Swiss national identity. We have other data I didn't have a chance to get to today showing that Canadians, when you prime them with their Canadian identity, they find that maple syrup tastes sweeter. Because again, if you've been to Canada, as I have for many, many years, I'm Canadian, maple syrup is a huge part of the Canadian national identity. In fact, there's a strategic national reserve of maple syrup in Canada. And so it turns out that when you remind Canadians of their Canadian identity, they prefer the taste of maple syrup over honey, whereas they wouldn't otherwise. And so our groups and our identities, when they become active in our mind, shape even potentially these basic aspects of our perception. And importantly, group identities are dynamic. They're not fixed. We don't always have to see ourselves in terms of, for example, our racial identity. It takes a flip of a coin to see ourselves as part of a new team and a new group. And we've done it with the lions and the tigers, overestimators, the underestimators, the blue team and the red team. All of these things seem to work in terms of changing how we're seeing the world around us, in part because the human brain seems prepared to see the world in terms of groups and to favor group members. Even as I showed you with the work by anthropologists, anonymous group members, people we don't even know, have never interacted with or met. We tend to prefer them and respond to them differently. And this is something that truly seems to differentiate humans from other non-human primates. And we think this has big implications. I've shown you some evidence. in terms of changing people's prejudice, changing potentially discrimination, legal decisions through things like eyewitness testimony, discriminatory policies like building walls between two countries or two groups. And in our more recent studies, we've also seen to show that it affects things like, again, smelling chocolate or tasting maple syrup may have implications for things like dieting decisions and health decisions. So we think that thinking about groups in this way and understanding this kind of dynamic nature of identity might have big implications for a number of different major social issues. So with that, I just want to pause and tip my hat to people who are historical figures who seem to have a deep understanding of this. So I will say there is some research showing, for example, that politicians who are most successful tend to be ones who use collective pronouns, saying we instead of I, predicts electoral success. Great moral leaders are great not because they have a strong individual vision of morality, that it seems to be, future focused and beyond the limitations of the social norms of their time, but they're people who are able to get a large number of others on the same page. And that they seem to have this understanding of what language works and what rhetoric works and what manipulations they can do to get people on the same page to protest and to make individual sacrifices to make collective change. And so these things are, I would argue, many of the major issues that we face as society, from discrimination to mobilizing social change. And a lot of it can't be understood fully without understanding how our collective identities are wound up in the way that we think about the world. So with that, I just want to thank the many PhD students and postdocs who've been involved in this research that I showed you today. Certainly many collaborators, countless graduate students who and undergrads who've made some contribution to this work, and then my colleagues who I did my PhD at the University of Toronto, my postdoc at Ohio State, and then now as a professor at NYU, who've been instrumental in shaping and advising and mentoring me and my students on this research. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to have a few minutes for discussion and questions. So I'll pass it back to Kateri, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jay. We do have some questions already, and I will start with reading those, but if anyone else has any questions to ask, you can type them right into the question box. Okay, the first question is, how might belonging to multiple somewhat opposing groups affect cognition? For instance, attending a homogeneous high school, then attending a diverse university?
That's a great question. So I think, I'll speak for myself. I attended incredibly homogeneous high school in a small town in northern Alberta. And it was jarring for me to go to a diverse university in a major city and interact with people from different ethnic groups, religious beliefs, from different sets of experiences. And I felt like it was jarring for me, and I had many friends who had the same situation, and they were incredibly bigoted, I'm sure I was too, on a number of issues. And it really was transformative in opening our minds to different perspectives and erasing a lot of the negative views that we had about the world that were partly just because we hadn't been exposed to anything else. And so I think that's part of what's great about exposure to new people and new ideas, why going to university and college can be a profoundly mind-opening experience for people. Certainly these are a lot of things that happen outside the classroom, in dorms, at parties, with friends. And then I also want to say that this is something that is benefited by travel as well. Again, for me, it was partly just moving to a new city, to a new place, and getting outside and being able to kind of examine my biases and limited viewpoints for the first time, kind of in a more objective way. Not seeing them as just the way of reality, but starting to think, okay, why doesn't everybody believe that? And so I think this is a big part of what happens in post-secondary institutions, for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question is, are these effects as easily reversed as they are induced, or are established group perceptions more permanent?
So I would argue that there's good reason to think that established group identities and perceptions might be more permanent. But one of the reasons I think that we ignore is because we're in contexts that constantly activate them. And so let me use the example of race. One of the reasons I think that race is a major issue in the United States, for example, and certainly it's been in the news all weekend because of this NBA owner who made these racist comments this weekend, and he was caught on tape. It really brought race back to the forefront of everybody's mind, and people are thinking in terms of race and racial conflict. But one of the reasons is because I think that we're in situations where we tend to interact with only people of our own race. And this is, we no longer have formal segregation, but we have what's often called de facto segregation. And what this means, and I'll give you an example, when I lived in Ohio, I would pull up to a gas station in my car in different parts of Columbus, Ohio. And it was almost always the case that everybody at the gas station who worked there and who was filling up was all black or all white. So even though there was some racial diversity in Columbus, it wasn't really happening at the neighborhood level. At the neighborhood level, there were black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. And so I think this is what happens. And when you pull into a gas station where everybody is of a different race, it's jarring, and suddenly makes you aware of your own race, and it makes it hyper-salient. And so I think that's one of those things that if you actually had more truer diversity, where there's more, truly mixed race groups and more diverse groups, rather than just having diversity, but all the Asian students sit in one part of the cafeteria and all the black students sit in another part, all the white students sit in another part. If you have that happening, you might have a diverse student body, but you're not actually getting any of the benefits of diversity because people aren't interacting across ethnic groups. So I think that's one thing that happens, is that certain identities are just made salient all the time because we tend to cluster in these groups. And if you could break that up and mix people a bit more, then you might not get people always thinking in those terms.
Thank you. And our third question is, are adult brains as malleable for these effects as children's brains, or are adults still more likely to be subject to previously held racial outgroup biases?
This is an excellent question. So there's lots of work emerging with kids, and now they're starting to find that kids, young kids show some kind of racial bias on measures like the IAT. But they're now showing that kids' brains are flexible too. So I have a collaborator and good friend, Yarrow Dunham, who's been doing a lot of work with kids with minimal groups. And he's found that kids can actually quickly identify with different groups. I think it's after age 5 or 6. And so it seems like kids are pretty fluid. And it seems to me that in my research, I find over and over again how fluid adults are too. So I really think that both groups are fluid. The only thing I would argue that might make grown adults seem a little less flexible or fluid is that they build up these associations by learning stereotypes and having personal experiences. If they have bad experiences with certain groups, then it can be hard to erase those. And I will say that I'm sure we all have family members or friends who seem really rigid in their perspective about a certain group. And maybe it was when they were a kid, there was more conflict, or they read the news and see certain stereotypes played out over and over again. And it can be really hard to influence certain people. And my bet is that there's going to be more adults like that with a closed mind than there are going to be with kids. So I think, yeah, interventions that work on kids early on are probably your best bet. But I don't know of any research that has compared that inflexibility of kids and adults.
Okay, great. And I believe that's all the questions we have. And so I will be sending out a follow-up email with a short webinar survey. We would very much appreciate it if you could all fill it out so we can improve our webinars going forward. And another note, we will have a recording on YouTube if you're interested in watching the session again. And please feel free to be in touch if you have any questions at all. Once again, I just want to thank everyone for attending today and for sharing your good thoughts with us. And also a big thank you to Professor Van Bavel for presenting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.